Hey gang, and welcome to this special edition of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. This volume is kind of a true kickoff to summer, and it's nothing but creepy camping stories that I hope you'll enjoy. I love camping, and I'm looking forward to doing some in the Adirondacks this summer myself. And real quick, I'd like to give a shout out and a thank you to subscriber Autumn G for letting me know that there are some YouTubers out there stealing the hard work of myself and a lot of the more established channels too. Hey, we all want people to share, but we don't want them stealing and then asking for subscribers of their own based on what we do. Putting together these narrations is not the easiest thing in the world, and when someone is ripping you off, it's high bullshit. If you see someone pawning off my work as their own, please let me know, and I would also ask that you do the same for the other big guys as well. Also, consider becoming a patron of this channel. Find my page in the description and links throughout the video. Patrons will have access to content unavailable to others and other unique perks. Hey, think about it. You can donate as little or as much as you like for ad-free content that you won't hear anywhere else. More true scary stories are on their way, but enjoy this quick little start to the summer, or winter if you're living in a land down under. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. Stalked on a camping trip. When I was 20, my girlfriend at the time and I decided to take a week-long camping trip to some property that belonged to her father's friend. We were going to bring my Australian cattle dog Wrangler and her German Shepherd Zero. It was about a 4,000-acre undeveloped ranch in the northeast Texas woods, and the plan was to be taken by four-wheeler to a point on the property unknown by us, and then we would hike back to the main gate over the next week. I had a GPS unit for an emergency, but we planned on doing the trip with maps and compasses only. We were well equipped for the trip. We had enough food for 3 days and planned to hunt for the rest, water for 4 days and a water purifying system. All the necessary camping gear. My girlfriend also had her bolt-action .223 and a Taurus Judge, and I had my .22 rifle and a .40 cal Baby Eagle. We arrived at our destination and bid farewell to the friends that dropped us off on the four-wheelers. Our first day mainly we wandered around exploring and figuring out our plan. There was a creek running through the property that we thought we could follow, and it would get us pretty close to the gate. We had our plan and had done enough exploring, so we started setting up camp before dark. Our first night was very pleasant for the most part. Dinner by the fire with the dogs, chit-chatting all night till about midnight, and then we decided to turn in. I woke up around 2:30 with a strange feeling. I saw Wrangler and Zero at the door of the tent, very tense but not making any sounds. I knew right away something was up. Both of these dogs were well trained and very loyal and protective of us. I stepped out of the tent with a light and the .40 cal to look around and left the dogs with my girlfriend just in case. She didn't hear anything, she's a deep sleeper. I made my rounds around camp and found nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I passed it off as a pack of coyotes and went back to bed, trusting the dogs to watch out for us. We woke up the next morning, and I told her what had happened. We just blew it off and began our day. But the second night we set up camp near the creek, and things got a bit hairy. While sitting around the fire, we heard a very strange sound, something I've never heard before. The dogs began to growl and snarl, facing the woods north of us. We quickly drew arms and began to sweep the campsite. We found nothing, but the sound persisted all around camp. It was like a snarling, gargling, sniffing sound. We didn't sleep that night. No matter how much we looked and checked, we could never find the source of the sound, and the dogs were restless the entire night. By the third night, we were very restless too, and when night fell, we sat by the fire with arms at our sides. We were going to stay up in shifts to keep watch just in case. While I was asleep, I heard the dogs go off, and when I woke up I saw my girlfriend standing with Zero at her feet and her Judge drawn. I quickly took arms at her back. Something had apparently ran very rapidly behind our tent. She couldn't describe what it was, but then it ran by again. I caught a glance under the light of the fire behind us, and whatever it was big and very fast. It was running on all fours, but that's all I could tell. It sounded more like creature won this time. They were coyotes. Too big and way too fast. Heather spotted it again behind the tent and fired. We heard a nasty snarl, and Wrangler broke away from me and gave chase. I love my dog, but didn't dare go after him. I just called and called, but he didn't return. We stood there, guns drawn, for about an hour after she had fired. Everything was quiet. And then we heard rustling. We had our sights on the sound, and Wrangler came out of the woods running. He wasn't hurt, but he had blood on his back. After this, we decided to bug out at sunrise. We packed up and started hiking. We were about 2 days hiked nonstop from the gate, and we were ready to just do it. The last night we didn't camp. We broke out the headlights and just kept going. Whatever was in those woods was back, following us, but at a greater distance this time. Whatever it was followed us all night, and that was one of the most intense hikes I've ever had. We hiked with our guns in front and the dogs in back, and whatever was following us wasn't stupid. It stuck to our sides, usually about 40 yards out into the woods, and always out of sight. We stopped to rest for a few minutes around 4 a.m., and they stopped too. From what we could hear, it sounded like maybe 3 things were out there. They got closer when we stopped, and I thought I saw something and fired the .223. I didn't hit anything. Probably my mind was just playing games with me, but the shot scared them back to a much greater distance. By sunrise, they were gone again, and we made it to the gate before dark, and then hightailed it out of there. We returned the next day on 4-wheelers, and several other people came with us to have a look around. We went to the site of our second camp and found a blood trail from whatever the hell Heather had hit with the slug shot loaded in her judge. The trail ran for about 200 yards before we lost it. We found nothing else and headed back before darkness caught us again. We never found out what was out there, and no one had any experiences like that on the property before. To this day, I try not to talk about it too much because I even have trouble believing it sometimes. I try telling myself that it just was coyotes with mange or mutated or something, but Heather never let me believe that. Not too many creatures out there can take a 410 slug and bleed that much without going down, especially not a yote. All I know is that I won't camp on that property anytime soon. The Woman at Flic and Flac. It was 1971, and I was in my late 20s. I was then living in Rose Hill, Mauritius, not married yet and staying with my parents. One day, my dad met a South African couple while he was coming home from work, and found out they were tourists visiting with their backpacks, tents, and sleeping bags. My dad was a very friendly guy, and invited them to stay over with us for a few days. I remember the guy had a big blonde beard. He was very kind, his wife as well, but I forgot her face. We decided to go camping during a weekend on the west coast of Mauritius, in a place called Flic and Flac. This place is pretty now developed, but at the time was very wild with just a few houses. We went on a Saturday morning, found a nice place to put a tent, and organized the day. The South African man and his wife were very good swimmers and divers, so we spent a lot of time in the sea, catching fish, crabs, some lobsters, and we cooked all these goodies on a small homemade barbecue set. All of us, Mom, Dad, the couple, and me, really enjoyed the day. The sunset was beautiful, it was warm, and everything was perfect. The night was starry, and my dad was happy and drunk, and the couple was obviously having a great time. Since we were not fluent in English, communication was a bit difficult, but we could still make ourselves understand with gestures and sometimes drawing in the sand. It was great fun seeing my dad trying to converse with them with a very limited knowledge of English. Anyway, it must have been around 9 p.m. when this happened. We were all seated on the beach, watching the ocean as well as the starry sky by the campfire. It was just beautiful. Then we started to hear a sound. We couldn't determine the origin of it, but it sounded like a woman wailing. It was faint but clear since the place we were was wild and remote and there was no one around. The wailing was not constant, but would be heard from time to time. We put it on the sound of maybe some animals in the bush. Since we were not people living on the coast, we were kind of ignorant of any animals which could be active at night out there. We were seated on the beach facing the ocean when suddenly we noticed something coming out of the water on our left, about 30 or 40 meters away. It looked like a woman with a long white dress, just walking from the water. We could not see her face, but we could see she had very long hair. She silently walked by us and disappeared from our view into the vegetation. We found this very odd. I knew this was not normal, but didn't know what the others were thinking. And again, my dad was drunk and was just watching the scene with a little smile on his face. I tried to check if there was a house where the woman walked to, so I stood up and walked towards the sea and looked on my left to see where she went. There was only green, just bushes and trees. There were no lights or any buildings around. I was now scared because I was realizing that maybe we had just seen a ghost. I walked back to the bonfire and sat down and told everybody that I did not find any houses there. We stopped talking and stayed alert. We could now hear all the little noises of the night. We heard faint crackling like someone or an animal quietly walking on dry leaves. Then suddenly we heard a loud flapping noise on a tree nearby. It looked like a bunch of large birds, maybe even pigeons or bats or whatever, I don't know. They were all flying away. It scared us. And then my mom told me quietly she felt that something was not right. She felt like we were being watched. The South African couple was looking around with their glasses in their hands. Then suddenly, something heavy fell in front of us on the beach, about 5 or 6 meters away. I stood up to see what it was, but could not find anything. Everybody stood up and looked around. There was nothing there. Apart from my father, who was in a trip because he was too drunk, we were all scared. The couple talked between themselves, and I couldn't understand what they were saying, but they seemed quite concerned about the situation. I didn't know what to do. Should we stay there, or just go to sleep, or maybe we should leave? Which would be a pity, because we were enjoying such a nice time before seeing that woman. Later on in the night, we heard this bone-chilling scream like a woman being attacked, and it seemed very close to our camp. We were on our feet with eyes about to pop out from their sockets, and my heart was pounding so loud that I thought the others would hear it. The couple started to pick up their stuff, and my dad followed them. Mom and I packed everything away quickly, too. As we were doing so, some coconuts fell and rolled out into our camp as if someone had thrown them. We were now scared to death, and no one would talk. We heard running on the beach and then in the woods, but couldn't see anything. We heard running on the beach and then in the woods, but we couldn't see anything. We loaded up the car, and it was not easy because we didn't have a big car, and when we had come out here, we had taken the time to pack things so that they could actually fit. Now we were just piling up things, and the worst was the barbecue. It was still hot and dirty, and we didn't want to leave it. I remember burning myself more than once while trying to put it away. While we were packing up, things were happening around us. The screams seemed to originate from different places, and there were a lot of other noises too that were really irritating. We all jumped into the car, practically upon one another with all the stuff all around us. I decided to take the wheel because my dad was too drunk to drive. As we moved away, we got a shock. We saw a woman dressed in white standing by the little lane, just staring at us. I'm not kidding, it was bone-chilling. I stopped the car. She was standing about 4 or 5 meters away, and I didn't know what to do. I was too scared to move closer to her, but I knew it was the only way out back to the main road. We waited a few minutes as she just stood there staring at us. I heard my mom praying, and the South African couple mumbling something between them. And then we heard a huge bang like something had hit the car from behind. We all turned to see what had happened, and again, the atmosphere was very tense, and I think my dad was becoming sober very quickly. He was now swearing. We didn't see anything behind us, but when I looked forward, the woman was not there anymore. But then, the scariest thing happened. She was now standing right outside my door looking at me. I can't describe the utter fear which had taken a hold of me right then. I screamed, and my throat was sore for several days after. I just jammed on the gas pedal, and I think everybody screamed then. The car bucked forward, and the woman was still there looking at us. I remember not seeing her eyes or features because it was so dark. I drove off as fast as I could, and the poor car got shaken on the dirt road. We reached the main road relieved and shouting, "What the hell had we just seen?" Fortunately, Rose Hill is not far from Flic and Flac. because when we reached the town, the car broke down, and we were lucky that we were in town. The fan belt of the car had broken, and the engine stopped from overheating. This was in the 70s, so no cell phones or any towing services available on a Saturday night/Sunday morning. The couple and my mom walked home, which wasn't that far away, and my dad and I stayed by the car. Once she was home, Mom phoned a friend of my dad to help tow our car. We finally got home at around 11:30 the next day, completely exhausted. We invited my dad's buddy to have coffee, and we told him what had happened. He told us that place in Flic and Flac was haunted, and several people encountered that woman. He said that we were lucky because there were accounts of people walking to the sea in a trance and never coming back out. Basically, they drowned by possession. My dad's friend said that these events did not always happen, but they happened frequently enough that people talked about them. The South African couple stayed a couple of more days at home with us, and then they left. We never saw or heard from them afterwards. Can't blame them. I later discovered that there was a cemetery on the little road that led from the main road down to the beach. I never figured out who that woman or ghost or whatever it was, but I did know that she would come out of the ocean and walk to the cemetery regularly. And that's what the stories say. However, in the late 80s, she never came back and no one's reported a sighting of her. There have been no accounts of seeing her up to this day. I think that the urban development has made it, or her, change her walking plans every night. A Chance Meeting with Gizmo and Friend by Pandora's Bottle. An old guiding buddy of mine told me this story, and while I wasn't there myself, this happy-go-lucky, hyper fella got real pale and quiet while telling it. He would only tell it to me in the daytime, after weeks of badgering, and it was the only time I saw him scared in all the months we spent leading groups around Appalachia. I've been meaning to write this one down for a long while, so I'm going to tell it as close and as well as I can. He calls it the Gizmo story. Bear in mind, the names have been edited. I'm going to call my buddy Mark. Mark went camping in a state forest in Virginia with a group of his college friends. They were a small group of 4 from the outdoor rec department, experienced kids with all the necessary gear and in familiar terrain. Being college kids, however, they rolled into the campsite fairly late and decided to just car camp. It's camping near the car, no hike to a separate location. It was early evening, but still before sun had set at least. As they were unloading the car and setting up camp, 2 mangy fellas came out of the woods and approached them. These guys looked like they'd been living out there for quite some time, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but they acted very odd. They wouldn't look you in the eye and seemed really twitchy, just kind of hanging around like they wanted something, like coyotes. My buddy Mark, he got the gitchy feeling right away. The guys introduced themselves. Now, nobody I've spoken to can remember the first man's name. It was something unremarkable like Bill or Rick. But the second guy, he said his name was Gizmo. Funny name, hard to forget. So Gizmo and his friends started asking questions. Questions like, "Y'all fixin' to stay the night? How much food you got? When are you kids supposed to head home? Y'all got phones on you? Any more y'all planning on showing up?" Well, Mark didn't like that one bit, so he started telling tales. "Yeah, there's going to be 8 or 10 more of us showing up tonight. Our parents expect us home first thing tomorrow morning. And they're super paranoid, so we got to get home on time or they'll call the cops. Parents, am I right? That sort of thing." Gizmo and company poked around camp a bit more, then wished the group good luck and disappeared back into the woods. Mark and his friends joked nervously about Gizmo and his friend, but weren't worried enough to actually leave. They built a fire and cooked dinner, and cleaned up and hung up the bear bag. They spent the rest of the evening hanging out around the fire, chatting and drinking. By midnight, they had all turned in. They had brought 2 tents, a girl's and a boy's. Well, Mark didn't feel right sleeping in the tent. He felt like somebody needed to keep watch, so he lay down by the fire. Sometime later, Mark found himself awake. The fire was dying when he opened his eyes, and he couldn't see much beyond the campsite, except for one bright burning spot. There was a light out in the woods. It bobbed along at chest height, occasionally disappearing behind the trees, sometimes pausing. Whoever it was at a good distance, maybe 100 yards out. When he told me the story, the distance was between here and that tree, so I can't be certain. He followed it for a while until it went out. He stared at the darkness for a long time until he eventually fell asleep once more. Suddenly, Mark woke up again, this time in a panic. The fire was down to embers, barely glowing. He opened his eyes to see that strange light in the forest was back, and it was much closer now. He could see that it was from a lantern, and he watched as the lantern carved a smooth perimeter around the campsite, occasionally going out, but always reappearing a short distance away. Mark pretended to roll on his back and sleep so he could watch. It circled the campsite twice, getting closer each time. The strange thing is that there were no sticks breaking, no leaves crunching. Somebody traipsing around in the dark woods that close should have made a lot more noise. Whoever it was trying to be real quiet. Mark lay there, tense and unmoving. By the time it began its third rotation of the campsite, the lantern was so close that Mark could see a face illuminated in it. It looked like one of the guys from earlier. He couldn't remember which one. His eyes were bugged out, scanning the campsite like a predator, and he was sweating. Then the lantern went out. At this point, Mark woke up. He got up and started making lots of noise, stoking the fire and packing his gear. His watch read that it was 4:30 or so, and the sun wasn't up yet. He considered all that had happened and made the tough call to wake up his buddies and bug out. Nobody argued when they saw his face. Like I said, this guy is happy-go-lucky, a human golden retriever, and an experienced woodsman to boot. You'd believe him too if you saw his face. The sun was barely starting to come up by the time they got in the car. As they were driving out, they passed something they hadn't noticed on the way in. There was an old RV parked out in the woods, camouflaged with a mixture of earth-colored tarps and actual greenery. It was surrounded by a chain-link fence, which was also draped with camo tarps and leafy boughs. The whole thing looked like a long-term hunting campsite. Mark and his friends were actually relieved. Gizmo and his friend might have been poachers, and that would explain their creepy stalking behavior. They had been trying to scare the kids away from the hunting site, Scooby-Doo style. Still cautious, they hightailed it out of there and counted their lucky stars that they weren't deer. And that should have been the end of the story. This next part I don't understand. I don't know why Mark or his friends didn't tell anybody about Gizmo for a few weeks. I would have thought for sure he'd report poachers ASAP. He's very type A, and it's not typical for him to procrastinate or let a rule go unenforced. I don't know what his excuse was, but Gizmo and his pal were forgotten. Then one day, Mark mentions the incident to a law enforcement officer from the Department of Natural Resources that came and lectured at one of his classes. She asks casual questions at first, just being polite, but then stiffens at the mention of the name Gizmo. "By any chance, do you remember the other guy's name?" she asked. "No, it was something normal, I don't remember." "God," she replied, "they always say that." Turns out that a part of this woman's job was investigating the murders that occur in Virginia state forests. Most are body dumps for crimes that occurred elsewhere, but over the last decade, a series of unsolved cases stretching all the way into West Virginia had targeted what appeared to be random, unrelated campers. But when they interviewed others camping in the area around the time of the murders, they all mentioned the same uncanny detail. They had all been approached by an individual named Gizmo and another man, whose name no one can ever seem to remember. The Forest Witches by Railoto. I went camping in Big Sur, California with one of my best friends. It was off-season and a Sunday night, so the place was practically empty. We picked a campsite about a half-mile walk to the ocean. It was in a huge open field surrounded by a lush forest, and in the background were the limestone mountains. You could hear the crashing of the ocean's waves. Pretty epic. We spent the night around a campfire telling stories and eating. We were both pretty experienced backpackers, and were very diligent in ensuring we do not leave a trace of food by our site, and almost everything other than our essentials goes in the bear bag. I had my dog with me too. She was ADA, so she was allowed on the site. She was leashed around one of the trees in the field, on a long metal leash in a full harness. It was a full moon, and it was pouring beautiful blue light across the field. I can't tell you, it was absolutely pristine and breathtaking. Around 1 a.m., something spooked my dog. Now, she's used to the woods and has an incredibly calm demeanor, but I mean she was flipping out and tugging hard on the leash like she was desperate to escape. And she did. She pulled so hard that her harness snapped, and she went bolting across the field into the wilderness. I lost my cool, and I dropped everything and bolted after her. I'm not thinking straight running into the woods at night, but my only concern was getting her even if it meant risking my own safety. I did rescue her. I found her curled up in a random clearing in the woods, looking ashamed and terrified. Thank God she ran in a straight line, otherwise I would have been totally lost. I walked back to camp carrying her, and my heart was pounding furiously at the horror of the idea of her being lost in the wilderness forever. Even thinking about it now is still unbearable. I could feel her heart pounding in my arms. She was terrified. Well, I was no longer in a great mood. We all decided to head to bed in my tent, but my dog wouldn't lay down. She refused. Her ears were up, and she was staring intently at the tent wall, as if she could see through it, and she was tracking something. It took a while for my nerves to calm down before my chase earlier, so I was working hard at taking deep breaths and reminding myself that I'm prepared for anything that I could encounter. That my dog is simply spooked from maybe a raccoon or something she saw out there. And I thought maybe she's just exhausted and acting up. But then I heard it. Cackling. Like a high-pitched laughter that is full of a disgusting type of joy, and it's coming from outside my tent. And fuck deep breathing, my senses went on high alert, and my body tensed up so tightly it was like I was about to break in half. Honestly, I couldn't even breathe. And then I heard even more cackling, like a group of witches were doing something evil just yards away from our campsite. It filled my hearing, laughing and laughing and more laughing. It's loud and it's just so wrong. I couldn't even bring myself to move to look up at my friend. It was like my entire body had given up. And then the laughs were followed up with blood-curdling screams. I mean, it honestly sounded like somebody was being murdered. Just this noise that was full of panic and horror and sadness. Jesus, dear God. It could have been wolves or coyotes killing their prey, I suppose, but it sounded so distinctly human. The laughter, the sobbing, the screams. Finally, my friend said something like, "What? What the fuck?" I found myself starting to laugh a little because the situation was so intense and wild, I really didn't know how else to react. "I can't handle this shit," I said, and I suggested we bolt for the car. It was a mile away, so we decided to stay out. We just sat there listening to the laughter and screaming until it faded away. Even when it was over, I didn't bother going to sleep. Bicentennial Nightmare by Wheelhorse Lover. When I and my wife were quite a bit younger, we decided that we would spend the bicentennial outdoors. Yeah, July of '76. We're old. We lived in Pueblo at the time and decided to go hiking, fishing, and camp along Lime Creek between Durango and Silverton. There wasn't anything other than brookies in the creek, but they were plentiful and fun to catch. We left our car by the side of the road along Old Lime Creek Road about 5 miles in from the highway and packed in upstream along the creek with our shepherd, Rebel. It only took us about an hour to get where we wanted to camp, a nice meadow beside the creek just before a slot canyon that required you to swim to get any further upstream. It was either that or take a several-mile detour. We camped uneventfully that night, the 3rd of July, enjoying the sounds of the rippling creek and nature all around us. It was such a nice night that we just slept out under the stars and didn't bother to pitch our little backpacking tent. A little cool, but we had the fire going in our lightweight 30-degree bags, so we were pretty comfortable. The next day we had breakfast, packed up, and we all swam our way up the creek to the next wide spot with a bit of bank in the canyon, only about 150 yards or so. Now, Rebel was never one to turn down a chance to get wet, but we had to do quite a bit of coaxing to get him to follow us up the creek. We fished and splashed upstream a bit, and before we knew it, it was lunchtime. We thought we'd fry up some of those brookies, but we were in the slot canyon that terminated in a fairly deep pool with about a 10-foot rocky waterfall at the end of it. We decided that I would scale the waterfall and pull the dog and the packs up, and then I'd help Maggie get up. It was fairly difficult, even with the help of an old cable left over from a mining operation that was hanging down the side of the wall of the canyon. It took a lot of effort, and though we finally made it, we looked back down that waterfall and wondered what the heck we were thinking. Rebel was none too happy about it either. It seemed to get more irritable by the minute. We found enough driftwood at the rocky top of the falls to get a fire started, and got the fish fried up. but that was about it. You know the uneasy feeling that you always get with stories like this? It was like a switch turned on, and we all of a sudden became aware of our surroundings. It grew like a cancer, and I actually watched the hair on the back of Rebel's neck stand up. Maggie felt it too, and we both noticed that it was getting dark fast down in this canyon. First thought in my head was a cat, and I actually felt a bit better about that because I figured a cat would leave us be, between the fire and the dog. I told Maggie what I thought, and she seemed to feel a bit better too. I did not want to get caught in the dark in the canyon, for a bunch of reasons, flash floods, etc. I spied what looked like a mine shaft about 200 feet above us. A heck of a steep climb, but it looked like our best bet. We pulled out our flashlights, and by the time we reached it, it was pitch black. The dog was a mess by this point, whipping around in circles, whining and yelping, and generally being a pain in the ass. Maggie and I were drenched with sweat and immediately began to freeze. July in the mountains is a weird thing. I've seen blizzard conditions before, but this was like someone turned on the deep freeze. We were at what looked like the start of a mine. It only went back about 10 feet, but there was evidence of fires at the mouth, and they curiously looked fresh. I was too tired to think more about it. I knew we had to get out of our wet clothes, pitch the tent, and climb in our bags before we got serious hypothermia. That was no fun, let me tell you, having to do all of that by the light of our rapidly dying flashlights, and there was no firewood anywhere close. I cursed myself several times for letting things get this far out of control. We finally got the tent pitched right there in the back of this little cave, buck naked as we had no dry clothes left. The sleeping bags were slightly damp too, even though we had stuffed them in plastic garbage bags before our swimming expedition up the canyon. We froze. It was miserable. About 1 a.m, I called Rebel into the tent for a little heat. The dog seemed to have calmed down greatly, and with the added heat we drifted off. Sometime during the night I heard something that just about woke me. I was still in a haze, so I fell asleep again immediately. I woke up another time because I thought I heard Rebel yip a little bit, but again I was in and out. I put my hand out to pet his head, and he licked my hand. I fell asleep again. Maggie later said she fell asleep the same time I did, but never woke up at all during the night. I woke up to the most horrible noise I have ever heard come out of a 100-pound woman. Just the most god-awful shrieks that I have ever heard. I never want to hear that again. I opened my eyes just in time to see a man at the mouth of the shaft, silhouetted against the morning daylight, looking back at us with the most twisted, evil grin I have ever seen on the face of another human. I scrambled to get free of my tightly zipped bag in the little tent while he just crouched there and grinned. When I was just about free, he disappeared. Now, we were granola-crunching, tree-hugging, anti-gun nature freaks at the time, so the only thing I had of any consequence as a weapon was my camp knife. I found it after what seemed like hours of searching, but was really probably under a minute. I very cautiously made my way to the entrance, millimeters at a time. The guy was gone. About that time, Maggie started screaming and whimpering again, so I rushed back to the back of the shaft. She had struggled out of the tent and was pointing at what used to be Rebel. His head was nearly severed, and the tent and the bags were ruined with all the blood all over everything. She had blood all over her, so the first thing I did was make sure she was not injured. Then I checked myself. We were okay. It was all Rebel's blood. We put on our still damp cold clothes from the night before, and then we noticed that our boots were gone. We were in trouble. I had some paracord, so we tied some shirts and towels around our feet and climbed back down towards the creek. We left everything in the mine, except for the knife and some stuff that we shoved in our pockets. It took us 8 hours to get back down to the car, and we were like hamburger. Hands, feet, arms and legs scraped raw, bruised and bleeding. When we jumped in, the car started right up, thankfully, and we left a dust cloud that blanketed the valley as we sped down the rough trail toward Durango. We limped into the sheriff's office, and we looked like hell. We got our story out, my wife through tears and me talking way too fast, but finally got it all out. The deputy said that they would go out first thing in the morning and asked us to stay in town. We had no money for a hotel, so he let us stay in a cell after we showered and changed into prison jumpsuits. We were there at the jail waiting when the expedition returned with the convoy of 3 trucks. I noticed that all the officers, who were quite wet and filthy, gave us dirty looks as they passed us, and the deputy that we had talked to the day before herded us back to his office. Then came the interrogation. It turns out that some animal had spread the dog's remains all down the side of the creek, and he said that there was nothing else there. No tent, no backpacks, nothing. He asked us if we had any drugs. I did not want to admit to him that we had some herb, so I denied it. It was clear that we were fighting a losing battle. They had come to the conclusion that we were wandering out in the woods high on LSD while a mountain lion had gotten our dog. The bastard even made us change back into our filthy clothes and give the jumpsuits back right then. He told us that he had better never see us again. And we left. Maggie was sobbing. I have never been back to Durango. The thing that I still have nightmares about years later, and I have never mentioned this to Maggie, is the second time I woke up when I heard Rebel yelp. Was that when his throat was cut? And if it was it the dog who had licked my hand before I fell back asleep? I still go out in the wilderness, never overnight, out well before dark. Only with other people, and always with a gun. I respect animals, but I fear people. Ghost Dog Got Me Straight by Whistle. This was maybe 7-8 years ago when I was 20, and I'm really in a bad way. I've been fucking up my life via heroin for the past year, but after lots of help, love, and luck from friends and family, I was finally getting my head cleared. Almost there, above the black tar hell I'd gotten myself into. I decided to get out of the city and drive 2 hours out to a smaller town in Missouri, where Google Maps told me a small campsite by water was. I knew there wouldn't be many campers, because it had just started to get cold out, and the nights were about 40 degrees or so. Nearly there, as I'm driving down a misty morning road, just a picturesque straight 2-lane highway, there's this object laying in the road about a half-mile up. I slow my approach, and can see it's this shaggy mutt, just hanging out. I stopped and rolled down my window right next to it. She came up, licked my hand, and wagged her tail a bit. She had no tag, no tattoo for a chip, I later checked. She was just a dog with no name. Naturally, I popped open the passenger side door for her, and she was glad to hop in. So, now I got this dirty but friendly companion for my little excursion. The dog with no name. The entrance to the campsite was only a half-mile further, and as I suspected, there was no one around. I dropped a 5 in the honor box and picked the site closest to the stream. I set up my tent, the same one I'd set up for years with my dad as a kid. I collected some wood and started a fire. The dog with no name just circled the campsite, looking content enough to sniff some leaves and roll around in the mud. I went to check out the rivulet. It was about 30 feet wide and had a man-made stone dam you could walk across. To the west was the deeper part of the river, sort of pooling at the dam, and maybe an 8-foot drop to the east into calmer streams. Instantly, I wanted to go in, cleanse myself, symbolize, baptize, whatever. I grew up Catholic, so that kind of shit runs through my head to this day, though I'm far from religious. The dog watched me scoping it out the whole time from the campsite. I couldn't bring myself to do it, though, and I was hugely disappointed in myself. But it was cold, the water was brackish, and I didn't have a towel. So, I went back to the campsite to smoke cigarettes, eat hot dogs, and pet the dog with no name. Night falls quickly after all this meditation, and I roll inside the tent to sleep. My buddy sleeps inside the tent right next to me. This dog was fucking awesome if you couldn't tell that yet. I woke up for no reason I can put my finger on, and my main source of warmth, the dog with no name, was missing. I slide out of the tent, and I guess I had left it unzipped. But there she was, just sitting, waiting for me in pitch black, wagging her tail. I felt really strange, like something was happening there, and someone or something was telling me to get back down to the river and do the damn thing I wanted to do. We walked down the short trail together, surrounded by the blackness of a Missouri night. It was even colder than before, but I started to strip anyway, standing on the chilly stones of the dam. The dog with no name sat on the edge of the river again, just watching me, a slight wag. I'm now stark naked, staring into this black pool that looks like some kind of supernatural ink. And I should mention here that I hate swimming in water I can't see the bottom of. My imagination takes over and I freak out. In other words, I stand naked on the dam for over 10 minutes before I finally muster up the balls, albeit shriveled and tiny at this point, and say fuck it and dive into the blackness. It was cold as hell. I mean, it was scary as fuck, too. When I came up for air, I was thrashing wildly backwards towards the dam. Scrambling back onto the slick stones, I shook out my hair and was surprised how the adrenaline helped in keeping me warm. As I picked up my clothes and shoes, I looked over for my buddy at the river's edge. The dog with no name was nowhere in sight. Back at the campsite, I'm looking around, gently whistling, that kind of thing. I'm more than woken up now, so I go ahead and start another fire. Dawn is just starting to break. I have another hot dog for breakfast and figure I might as well just pack up and leave. The trip felt more than complete. As I started my car up and checked my phone, there was an hour time difference between the two, and this happened to fall on daylight savings time. I'm not calling it a supernatural rip in time, but it is funny that the night this went down, in fact, the exact time would be around 3 to 4 a.m. that the dog disappeared. So, the dog with no name never showed up, and I never shot up heroin again. P.S. I realized the dog was probably from a nearby farm and found her way home, but the coincidences were wild enough for me, and my mind needed all that at that time. The Manitou Islands, submitted by Dan McGee. There is a small group of islands in Lake Nipissing, Ontario, Canada, called the Manitou Islands. They are really pretty, and about 10 kilometers or so out from North Bay, Ontario. They are uninhabited, but people boat out them to hang out on the beaches and check out the variety of birds and such. Overnight camping is not really allowed, but when I was in my early 20s, some friends and I decided to do it anyway. They are supposed to be haunted, and people say the biggest island, which is called Manitou Island, actually speaks to people when they paddle or stay by there. Really, it's an eerie effect of the wind blowing through some volcanic tubes that actually form the islands. At any rate, we, that is, Teddy, Matt, Christine, Julie, and myself, wanted to check it out. We loaded up 2 canoes with our camping stuff and shoved off from Nipissing Beach, which is about 10 kilometers south. We figured no one would pay attention if we left from there, not from North Bay. Don't ask, it was just the way we thought at the time. This was in August, around 2005, and I remember the weather was really nice. We planned on staying overnight, and if things were cool and no one said anything to us, we would stay the whole weekend. Off we went, and it took us about 2 hours or so to get to the islands. Matt actually got there before the rest of us, as he had a kayak and was a lot faster. There was another family that was just leaving, and we talked with them for a while. I jokingly asked if anything spooky had happened, and they just laughed. They took off, and we pulled our canoes and kayak further up on the beach. We figured we would camp there, as the sandy side of the island is on the far side away from North Bay. If we had a fire, no one would see it from the mainland. It was about 4 in the afternoon when we poked around for wood, and Teddy accidentally stepped into some poison ivy, and we all laughed at him as he washed his leg and then dumped a ton of calamine lotion on it. Dumbass. It was warm enough that we were just going to sleep on the beach in our bivvy bags and blankets, but we brought tents just in case. After swimming around in the shallow water and just having fun, Matt and I got to work on digging a pit for the fire, and the girls started to break out some food. Oh, yeah, and the Molsons were flowing by this time. Matt and I were talking about the legends that people say the islands are cursed, and Julie was getting scared. The stories talk about the hardships that the Nipissing tribe had living in that area, and that the raiding Iroquois tribe helped to decimate their numbers. Some tales talk about how some of them tried to make it a go on the group of islands, and others talk about the failures of others hundreds of years later. I'm not sure if any of it's true, but I've also heard about a failed mining project as well as a hotel night spot failure. The mining thing actually is true. We saw the foundations there. But the other stuff, I don't know. It was getting on in the day, and we got a nice fire going and made hot dogs and beans for a supper. And we're really just happy being out there with our little group. We kept sipping on beers, and Matt broke out stuff for s'mores, and the fire was just the perfect atmosphere. We watched the sun set on the lake and got back to talking about the islands. Teddy actually wanted to borrow Matt's kayak and go over to Calder Island for some reason. It was only like a half kilometer away, but it was dark and Matt said no way. Teddy got irritated, and he was a little drunk and started going off. And that's when we heard it. This low moan seemed like it surrounded us. I immediately thought of the caves and how the wind worked, but this wasn't like that at all. This was right next to us. It happened so fast and went away, we laughed uneasily and just decided to blow it off. A few beers later, and now in total Canadian darkness save for the fire flames dancing around us, Christine said she needed to pee, and Julie said she would go with her into the brush. Matt and I yelled about poison ivy and then started laughing about how awful it would be to get that on your balls or your lady house, and even Teddy started to lighten up. This developed into even more gross jokes, and soon we were spitting out beer and laughing uncontrollably. And then we heard Julie scream, and Christine right after. We jumped up and saw them race out of the brush towards us, Julie practically jumping onto me. "What's up? Why are you screaming?" asked Matt. "There's someone out there," Julie basically screamed. I told her it was okay and that she needed to relax. "Who's out there? What are you talking about?" I asked. Christine jumped in and said that while they were taking care of business, they heard voices talking in a language they didn't recognize. It wasn't English and it wasn't French, and they were sure of that. They just said the voices were low and didn't sound friendly. "Oh hell, I'll go see," said Teddy. Matt reminded him about his poison ivy, and Teddy just said, "Yeah, well, what else can happen? My leg is already beat." He grabbed a flashlight and headed off into the dark. Seriously, you can look this place up on Google, and you'll see that the islands aren't that big. Where we were camped out maybe had 100 meters behind us to the other side of the island. It's possible someone else was out there, but that bothered me even more that somebody would want to mess with us. I grabbed another flashlight and headed after Teddy. Julie told me to stay, and I said it would be okay, and just put more wood on the fire. I yelled for Teddy, and he waited up. We went to the other side of the island and could see the lights of North Bay way in the distance. We then skirted the island in the water for a bit to avoid any poison ivy we might not see in the dark, but soon decided to head back to camp. When we got into the woods, I heard it. Soft voices whispering. I asked Teddy if he could hear them, and he said yeah. I asked him if we were just drunk, and he said no effing way. It sounded like the voices were coming from the tree branches above us, then behind us, then off to the sides. It was like we were surrounded. Without warning, a huge tree limb crashed to our left, and we booked it out of there back to camp. Another limb fell, and we just kept running. What was really messed up was the laughter. I kid no one, I heard something laughing. There's not a lot of anything other than birds on these islands, so this was freaky. Teddy and I burst back onto the beach, and Christine screamed again. Julie grabbed me, and I grabbed another Canadian and downed it in one shot. We told them what we heard, and the girls wanted to leave. Matt was cool about it, but in so many terms told them how stupid it would be to canoe in the dark back to the mainland, and that we should just settle down and ride things out. "Let's all just calm down and relax," said Matt, and I agreed with him. Teddy looked as white as a ghost and kept throwing more wood on the fire. It was blazing away, and honestly, it was comforting. I checked my phone for the time, and it was just about midnight. I figured the sun would be coming up in about 5.5 hours or so. If we stayed cool, we'd be able to leave at first light. The tension started to go away, and Matt and I tried joking with everyone again. Everybody eased up, and the girls and Teddy started to drift off. I grabbed a beer and threw one to Matt. We talked in low tones for a while before I noticed him staring at the far end of Great Manitou Island, to the southwest of our camp. I looked at him, and he jerked his chin in that direction. There was a light on the edge of the water and trees. Not a lantern or a flashlight, but a soft, cloud-like light, and it was slowly moving towards us. I looked to the other side of the cove, and there was a similar light on that side coming towards us too. That one was closer. "What are we going to do?" I whispered. He shook his head. We watched the things bob towards us, but before they got to the edge of the beach, they just disappeared. We looked at one another, but didn't say a word. He threw some more wood on the fire and said, "I get the feeling something or someone does not want us here, dude." I looked at my phone again, and just a few more hours and we could split. I wanted to go right then and there, but, like we said, Boating at night in a big lake after more than just a couple of pops was a worse scenario than staying put. Just before dawn, we heard the moaning again, and then a short bit later, some laughter. Teddy and the girls started rousing, and Matt got busy taking care of the fire. We quickly gathered up our stuff and loaded the canoes. After a fast brush down to the sand where we had stayed, you'd never even know that we were there. I did one more quick sweep of the area, and that's when I saw the footprints. Dozens of them, in all different shapes, all around the edge of our camp. They weren't there the day before. We certainly would have noticed them. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen until we got off the island, and we were halfway back to Nipissing Beach. There were a lot of get the hell out of here's and you're just making that up. But I wasn't. I'll go back there any time, but I probably won't be staying overnight again. Maybe the legends are telling the truth, and that we're not welcome there. We can't say for certain what it was that we experienced, but I will tell you this, it was pretty scary to say the least. Thanks for listening, gang. Please check out my Patreon page and be sure to stick around for more true scary stories. Find me on social media too, links are in the description below. Until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.